Dozens of Russian officials have traveled to Cuba in recent months, and some former Cuban government insiders are warning that Russia might plan to again use the island as a forward base on the United States doorstep. This week, Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel went on the Spanish-language version of Russia Today to insist on Cuba's unconditional support for Russia. "We condemn and we don't accept the expansion of NATO to the borders of Russia," he said. Last week, for the first time ever, Cubans appeared alongside Russians fighting in Ukraine, both in the Russian army and in the Wagner Group. Russia says they joined as volunteers and are not part of the Cuban army. But it was Cuba's regular armed forces that signed a deal this month to train troops in Belarus, a close ally of Moscow heavily involved in the Ukraine war. Vladimir Ruvinsky, a Russian expert on his country's relations with Latin America at the Instituto Colombiano de Estudios Superiores de Incada in Cali, Colombia, said the Kremlin sees Cuba as America's near abroad. Russians are interested in expanding the relation with Cuba from the logic of reciprocity, in order to say to the United States, "We're here again, and we may make some troubles for you, so pay attention to us," he said. Cuba's crisis of everything. The Russians are coming as Cuba faces its worst economic crisis since Soviet subsidies ended in 1991. Cuban agricultural production has collapsed and it must now import 80% of its food. But the pandemic cut the flow of tourists, bringing the hard currency Cuba needs to buy food overseas. President Donald Trump's tightening of restrictions on U.S. remittances to Cuba further reduced the Cuban government's reserves. Over the past few weeks, Russian oligarchs have signed agreements with Havana covering a wide range of commercial interests, supplying wheat to Cuba, investments in its sugar and rum industries, revitalizing ports, urban infrastructure and hotels. Russia has agreed to help restart Cuba's steel industry and, more importantly, supply the country with oil. The Cuban government does not have a strong position, former Cuban diplomat turned dissident Miriam Leiva said from Havana. It depends on the Russian government giving it oil, food and money. They are even allowing Cuban land to be leased for the first time, for Russian investors. There's a very big commitment from the president personally to support the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war. This distances us from the international community and leaves us isolated. Leiva, a former Communist Party member who worked in the Soviet Union and East Bloc countries during her time in Cuba's Ministry of Foreign Relations, said the new Russia can't afford to subsidize Cuba as the old Soviet Union did, but the new Cuba is so weak it has to take whatever it can get. Cuba's sovereignty is being compromised with all the prerogatives that are being offered to the Russians, she said. Those prerogatives include Havana allowing Russia to change Cuba's laws to protect its investments. The right the Cuban people don't have, the right to determine our laws and our constitution, is being given away to others, she said. What we Cubans cannot do, the others are going to do. That's the difficult and sad situation. The Cuban government did not respond to questions posed by CBC News. Ukraine the catalyst. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 gave Ukraine independence and launched an economic crisis in Cuba that moderated but never really ended. The dormant relationship between Havana and Moscow began to revive in 2014, when Russia turned to Cuba for diplomatic support for its annexation of Crimea. Havana obliged and in turn received forgiveness of 90% of its debts with Russia, over $40 billion, a sum Cuba was in no position to repay anyway. That same year, Russia said it would reopen its old spying station at Lourdes, Cuba, a facility Russian President Vladimir Putin closed as a cost-saving measure in 2002. But not much actually changed until early last year, when Russia was secretly preparing to invade Ukraine. It was Russian Deputy Defense Minister Sergei Ryabkov who brought up the idea of sending Russian troops to Cuba or Venezuela, a clear attempt to convince the West not to interfere in Moscow's plans for Ukraine. One month later, Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, a move Cuba immediately blamed on NATO. The next day, the Cuban government effectively warned Cubans not to question that position when it arrested a dissident who tried to lay a bouquet of flowers on the steps of the Ukrainian embassy. As the war began to turn sour for Russian forces, Cuba's situation was also worsening, said Cuban ex-diplomat Juan Antonio Blanco. The former member of the Communist Party's Central Committee for Foreign Relations said he became disillusioned when the party rejected reforms following the collapse of the Soviet Union. He ended up in exile in the U.S. He said Cuba's multiple crises reached a desperate state by October with the accelerating collapse of Cuba's energy grid. That was the final straw. All the indicators were in crisis, said Blanco. They realized suddenly that those power plants have run out of time and have to be replaced. They don't have the money to replace them. It's about $10 billion, US. They saw that protests were rising throughout the island. Either they get resources from somewhere or they would have to put away all that they know for the last 60 years. Like in 1991, they didn't want to go the democratic way. They decided to make another transition. Blanco said Cuba's rulers were not interested in following the Chinese or Vietnamese post-communist models of free market capitalism under an authoritarian government. They are more inclined to copy the Russian model of a dictatorship with a market that is controlled by oligarchs, he said. Capitalist innovations shock Marxists. the scale of Cuba's capitulation to Russian demands has caused shock in some international Marxist circles. Russian investors in Cuba have demanded and secured tax preferences, the right to repatriate profits and the power to hire and fire Cuban workers at will. Now the Russians come to Havana, said Blanco. And they say, well, we're ready to help, but you would have to change your constitution, change your laws, revise this or revise that. In less than a week, they're calling for the parliament to check everything out and see how they're going to accommodate the Russians. For Rolando Remedios, who was arrested in the protests against one-party rule that broke out across Cuba on July 11, 2021, the return of the Russians suggests the Cuban Communist Party believes it has no alternative if it wants to hold on to power. They are offering these incentives to Russian companies that Cubans do not receive, despite knowing that Russians will become more influential over Cuban affairs, he told CBC News from Havana. They'd rather empower a foreign power than empower the Cuban people. Havana's goal: avoid total collapse. The war in Ukraine still drives the alliance. Cuba abstained from the historic March 2 United Nations vote that saw 141 countries condemn the Russian invasion. By the fall, it had moved to a more openly pro-Russian position, voting with Russia and 5 other countries to block Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky from addressing the UN General Assembly, supporting the Russian annexation of 4 regions of Ukraine, and voting against a motion calling for Russia to pay reparations to Ukraine. Also in the fall, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov began to talk publicly about another scenario like the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Blanco, who maintains contacts on the island, said Putin sent a personal messenger to Raúl Castro, officially retired but widely seen as the real power in Cuba, at some point around that time. Two weeks later came a formal visit by President Miguel Díaz-Canel to Moscow. Following that visit, an army of Russian officials and oligarchs began to descend on Cuba. Since March, the island has hosted not only Lavrov, but also Nikolai Patrushev, who has headed Russia's Security Council for 15 years, Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Chernyshenko, Rosneft CEO Igor Sechin and Boris Titov, an oligarch with a presidential commission who led a delegation of Russian business leaders that signed agreements for 30 projects in Cuba. Today's Russia is not the Soviet Union, and Cubans know they can't expect assistance on the scale they received during the Cold War, said Ruvinsky. The Cuban regime's goal, he said, is to avoid the total collapse of the Cuban economy that's on the horizon.